Witches, the truth, buried beneath fire and fear.
Part 1. The whisper before the fire, before there were broomsticks, before pointed hats, before green skin, crooked noses, and children's stories meant to make monsters harmless. There were women and men who knew things about plants, things about the body, things about the moon, the seasons, the land beneath their feet, and for that, they were burned. Not because they flew, not because they cursed crops with a glance, not because they whispered spells into the dark, but because they represented knowledge that could not be controlled. This is where the story of witches truly begins. Not in fantasy, but in fear. Fear of what survives outside doctrine. Fear of what does not answer to authority. Fear of those who listen to older voices. The word witch did not always mean evil. In fact, for most of human history, it meant the opposite. A witch was a healer, a midwife, a diviner, a keeper of thresholds between life and death, sickness and health, past and future. Long before churches rose from stone, before scripture was weaponized, before the devil was given a face, magic was not rebellion. It was how people understood the world. We are taught a comforting lie, that the witch hunts were caused by ignorance, that people were simply stupid, superstitious, panicked, that once science arrived, the madness ended. But this is not true. The witch hunts were not chaos. They were organized, they were theological, they were legal, and most importantly, they were useful. Useful to rulers who needed an enemy that could not fight back. The witch was not discovered, she was constructed. Before history was written, long before Europe, long before Christianity, long before law, there were shamans, men and women who entered altered states, who spoke to spirits, or what we would now call the unconscious, who mediated between the visible world and the invisible one. They wore animal skins, they danced, they fasted, they hallucinated, not for entertainment, for survival. A successful hunt, a healthy birth, a cure, a warning. Magic, then, was not fantasy. It was early psychology, early medicine, early cosmology. Experienced, not theorized. And crucially, it was often women who held this role, because women lived closer to the cycles that terrified men. Men saw birth as miraculous and horrifying, blood without death, pain followed by life. Men hunted. Women knew. They knew which roots killed, which leaves healed, which mushrooms opened doors in the mind. They tracked the moon because the moon tracked them. And so the earliest gods of magic were not demons, they were goddesses. The moon remembers Diana, Hecate, Selene, Isis, different names, same power. The moon was not romantic, it was dangerous. It governed tides, cycles, madness, fertility, death. To worship the moon was to accept that reality was not fixed, that it flowed. This terrified later religions built on certainty. For thousands of years, the old religion, the earth-based, moon-centered traditions, coexisted quietly with new beliefs. They were tolerated, absorbed, ignored, until belief became power. When religion merged with law, when doctrine demanded obedience, when salvation became centralized, the witch became a problem because she did not need permission to speak to the divine. The early church did not fear witches at first. In fact, early Christian texts dismissed witchcraft as illusion. But illusion is only harmless until it threatens authority. When heresy rose, when dissent spread, when people questioned the moral legitimacy of the church itself, suddenly, the old practices were no longer quaint, they were treasonous. And treason demands punishment. What follows is the story of madness. It is a story of systematic erasure, of how ancient knowledge became criminal, how women's wisdom became sin, how magic became evidence, and how fear, once unleashed, learned to feed itself. Because once you convince people that evil walks among them, they will light the fires themselves. Part 2. Before witches had a name. Primitive people knew something modern culture forgot, that the earth is not inert. It responds. And some people learned how to listen. The shaman existed between worlds, conscious and unconscious, human and animal, living and dead. They fasted, they danced until collapse. They isolated themselves in darkness or cold.
They consumed plants that dissolved the ordinary boundaries of perception. This was not play, it was initiation. Across cultures, from Siberia to the Amazon, shamans described the same experience. A sense of leaving the body, a journey through darkness, encounters with beings that teach, test, or threaten, a return, changed. The writer Colin Wilson points out something unsettling here. These experiences are not symbolic metaphors, they are structurally identical across continents and millennia, which raises an uncomfortable question. Were they hallucinating, or were they accessing something real? Something human consciousness is capable of entering under specific conditions. To modern ears, magic sounds like fantasy. To ancient people, it was technology, not mechanical, psychological, neurological, a way to access hidden faculties of the mind. The shaman did not command spirits like a master, they negotiated. They entered altered states where intuition dominated logic, where the right side of the brain took control. This mattered because the unconscious processes far more information than the conscious mind ever could. Patterns, threats, connections. What looked like prophecy may have been extreme intuition. What looked like magic may have been a heightened perception of reality. As societies grew more complex, something changed. Hunting tribes became agricultural communities. Seasonal rituals replaced migratory survival. Stability replaced constant movement. Magic adapted. The shaman's role split into two paths. One remained sacred, healing and blessing, fertility and protection. The other became personal, revenge, control, and harm. This is where the idea of black magic begins, not as evil, but as misuse. Using deep psychological forces to satisfy ego, to bend reality for personal gain. And this is where fear begins to grow. Men hunted, fought, built, women stayed. They observed. They noticed which plants healed infections, which roots eased childbirth, which mixtures caused death. They became midwives, healers, keepers of law. Women had time to observe patterns, time to experiment, time to pass knowledge orally. Magic moved indoors. What we now call witchcraft was once simply religion, a religion without scripture, without hierarchy, without centralized control. There was no devil, there was no sin, there was balance. This belief system did not demand obedience, it demanded participation, and that made it dangerous. Across Europe, stone circles rose from the earth: Stonehenge, Avebury, Karnak. For centuries, scholars argued over their purpose. Temples, tombs, astronomical observatories, the answer may be all of these, and none. What matters is this: these places align with celestial events too precisely to be accidental. They track solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills. They sit on geomagnetic anomalies, places where dowsers still feel something strange. Our ancestors did not build these because they worshipped rocks. They built them because they believed power flowed through the land, and certain people could feel it. For centuries, these practices survived quietly. Christianity spread, but it absorbed what it couldn't destroy. Pagan festivals became Christian holidays. Fertility rites became folk traditions. Old gods became saints, but the memory never vanished. And memory is dangerous, because memory resists authority. Magic became a problem when it stopped being communal, when it empowered individuals, when people trusted a healer more than a priest, when folk wisdom contradicted doctrine. This is when the word witch began to change. Witchcraft did not emerge from ignorance. It emerged from knowledge, from a deep, experiential understanding of the human mind and the natural world. And when centralized power finally turned against it, the fires were not lit to destroy superstition. They were lit to destroy independence. Part 3. Goddesses, not demons. There is a moment in every purge when reality must be rewritten, not erased, inverted, because destroying a belief is never enough. It must be made evil. This is where the goddesses fall. The old religion was not aggressive. It did not conquer. It did not convert. It did not demand belief. It endured. And endurance is intolerable to any system that claims absolute truth. By the early Middle Ages, Europe was officially Christian, but beneath the surface, older practices continued quietly. In forests, on hilltops, at crossroads, in the hands of women and men who never learned Latin, but understood life far better than theologians ever would. They still remembered the names. Diana was never a devil. She was older than sin. She ruled the moon, the hunt, childbirth, and the wilderness. She was the boundary between civilization and nature. To worship Diana was to accept that the world could not be fully domesticated. This made her intolerable. Christian chroniclers repeatedly mention women who claim to ride at night with Diana, not physically, but in spirit. Early church authorities dismissed these journeys as dreams, but even dismissal is a form of recognition, something that refused to die. If Diana represented the living world, Hecate ruled the thresholds. She stood at crossroads as well as doorways and grave sites. She held keys, not metaphorical ones, but keys to altered states, to death, to rebirth, to the unseen. Hecate was invoked in magic not because she was evil, but because she governed transitions, and transitions terrify authority because they imply change. In the 19th century, folklorist Charles Leland recorded something the church had tried very hard to erase: a surviving gospel. Not Christian, a witch's gospel, Aradia, or the gospel of the witches. According to this text, Diana bore a daughter, Aradia, who was sent to earth with a purpose: not to rule, not to judge, but to teach. Aradia taught the oppressed to resist injustice, how to use magic against tyrants to curse those who exploited them. This is the detail historians often skip. Witchcraft, in its oldest surviving form, was political. It was resistance. The church did not fear witches because they worshipped demons. It feared them because they empowered the powerless. Here is the most brutal inversion of all: Lucifer. The name means light bringer. It originally referred to the planet Venus, the morning star, a celestial body associated with dawn, renewal, beauty. Lucifer was not evil, he was solar, and solar deities were everywhere in pagan religions. As Christianity rose, solar gods became rivals, so they were rebranded. The horned god, once a fertility symbol, became Satan. The goat, once abundance, became filth. Sexual rites, once sacred, became perversion. How the devil was built. The devil was not discovered. He was assembled, piece by piece. Horns from pagan gods, hooves from nature. Spirits, fire from purification rituals, sexuality from fertility rites. The result was not a being. It was a weapon, a psychological construct powerful enough to justify violence. And witches were placed at its center. Once witches were linked to the devil, anything became permissible. Torture became holy. Confession became proof. Execution became salvation. Because now the witch was not a neighbor, she was an enemy of God. And enemies of God do not get trials, they get erased. Women suffered most. This was never accidental. Women controlled birth or controlled by emotions and practiced rituals outside male authority. They represented unregulated power. The church could not control the womb, could not control healing without priests, could not control knowledge passed mouth to ear, so it criminalized it, and then sanctified the punishment. Pagan festivals survived for centuries: May Day, harvest rites, solstices. To the church, this was intolerable. So the Sabbath was transformed from celebration into conspiracy. Witches no longer danced. They plotted. They no longer honored nature, they worshipped Satan. Every accusation followed a script. Because the script had already been written, once witches were declared servants of the devil, they ceased to be people. And once someone ceases to be human, there is no limit to what can be done to them. Burning becomes mercy, death becomes cleansing, suffering becomes proof. And now, the machinery was ready. The goddesses had fallen, the devil had been invented, the witch had been redefined. All that remained was procedure. Part 4. The invention of the devil and the birth of the witch hunts. There is a moment when fear stops being emotional and becomes administrative. That is the moment witchcraft becomes fatal. For centuries, the church officially taught something surprising, that witches were deluded. Early Christian doctrine, including the canon episcopi, explicitly stated that women who believed they rode at night with Diana were victims of illusion, not criminals. In other words, witchcraft was considered imaginary, and for a long time that position held. But illusion is harmless only when it lacks power. And by the 13th century, power was exactly what the church feared it was losing. The witch hunts did not begin with witches, they began with heretics. Groups like the Cathars, spiritual purists who rejected church wealth and corruption, spread rapidly through Europe. They questioned authority, they rejected priestly hierarchy. They emphasized personal purity over obedience. This terrified Rome. So the church responded with its most efficient weapon, the Inquisition. Once the machinery for rooting out heresy existed, it needed enemies, and the witch was waiting. In 1326, Pope John XII made a critical move. He officially linked magic to demonology. From this point forward, magic was no longer illusion and was no longer treated as superstition. It was collaboration with demons. This single decision transformed folk practices into capital crimes, and suddenly witches weren't confused villagers, they were traitors to God. Once demonology was accepted, a dangerous logic followed. If the devil exists, and if the devil seeks to corrupt humanity, then he must have agents, and those agents must be hidden among ordinary people. Witches became the perfect enemy. Anyone could be one. The witch hunts did not rely on proof, they relied on confession, and confession was guaranteed. Because torture was not meant to discover truth, it was meant to produce narrative. Interrogators already knew what witches did. They flew, copulated with demons, they cursed crops and murdered infants. The accused only had to confirm the script. Pain did the rest. Across Europe, from Germany to France to Scotland to England, witch confessions follow identical patterns. Not because witches shared secrets, but because interrogators shared manuals. They asked the same questions, they expected the same answers, they punished deviation. Truth did not matter, consistency did. It is tempting to believe the witch hunts were hysteria. They were not. They were rational within their own framework. They followed rules, they cited authority, they used experts. They were bureaucratic murder, and bureaucracy is always more dangerous than rage. One of the most grotesque tools of this system was the search for the devil's mark. Any mole, any scar, any insensitive patch of skin, these were proof. Women were stripped, probed, examined publicly. Not for justice, but for humiliation. And once a mark was found, and one always was, guilt was sealed. Even monarchs participated. James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, became obsessed with witchcraft after surviving a violent storm at sea. He believed witches had tried to kill him, so he wrote Demonology, a theological justification for witch persecution. When kings fear witches, no one is safe. Confessing did not save you, denying made torture worse, naming others delayed your execution, but guaranteed theirs. The system fed on itself. Witch hunts did not end because truth emerged. They ended only when society exhausted itself. By the time the fires burned hottest, the devil no longer needed to exist. Fear sustained itself. Neighbors accused neighbors, children accused parents, communities collapsed inward, and all of it was called righteousness. Part 5. The machinery of death. By the late 15th century, the witch was no longer a rumor. She was a case file, and death had become a process. In 1487, a book was published that would outlive empires. The Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, written by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor whose earlier witch trials had failed due to lack of evidence. The book was not theology, it was a manual. A how-to guide for identifying, interrogating, and executing witches, devastatingly effective. The Malleus did something revolutionary. It standardized fear. It argued witches were real. Witches were predominantly women. Women were more susceptible to the devil. Mercy was weakness, and doubt was heresy. It dismissed skepticism as complicity. And most importantly, it told judges exactly how to win. The Malleus dismantled legal safeguards one by one. Accusers could remain anonymous. Hearsay was admissible. Contradictions proved guilt, and the accused had no right to defense. In fact, hiring a lawyer was itself considered suspicious. Justice was no longer blind, it was hunting. Torture was not a last resort, it was central. Because the goal was never truth, it was confirmation. If the accused confessed under torture, guilt was proven. If they didn't, it meant the devil was protecting them. Either way, the system won. Torture methods were carefully calibrated, not to kill, but to break. Sleep deprivation. The strappado, dislocating shoulders by suspension. Crushing thumbs and legs. Mock executions. All while interrogators calmly recorded answers. This was not rage, it was administration. Once someone confessed, the interrogators demanded names. Every witch belonged to a network. Every sabbat had attendees. Every crime had accomplices. Refusal meant more pain. Compliance meant delayed death. So names were given, and the fires multiplied. Witch hunting became a career. Some men traveled town to town offering their services. They were paid per conviction. The incentive was obvious. The more witches found, the richer the hunter became. In some regions, children were encouraged to testify. Their imaginations were treated as evidence. Nightmares became confessions. Stories became facts. Once children accused adults, there was no reversal. Salem is often treated as a unique tragedy. It wasn't. It was simply late. By the time Salem occurred, Europe had already perfected the formula. Salem just followed the script. The same machinery, different continent. Ironically, the system collapsed under its own weight. Too many accused, too many contradictions. Too much collateral damage. When accusations reached the upper classes, skepticism suddenly became reasonable. The hunt slowed. Not because the innocent mattered, but because the powerful were finally threatened. By the 18th century, executions dwindled, but they did not vanish overnight. The belief started to linger. Part 6. Real people, real witches. There was no such thing as a typical witch. They were young and old, poor and respected, illiterate and intelligent. What united them was not belief, it was vulnerability, and often independence. Joan of Arc is remembered as a saint. She should also be remembered as a witch, not because she practiced magic, but because she followed the same pattern. She heard voices. She claimed divine guidance. She defied male authority. She wore men's clothing. And worst of all, she succeeded. That made her intolerable. Her trial was not about treason. It was about unauthorized revelation. When asked where her voices came from, Joan answered calmly, "From God." That answer sealed her fate, because only the church was allowed to speak for God. Joan was burned alive in 1431, officially for heresy, unofficially for reminding the world that power does not always flow downward. Agnes Sampson, the healer. Agnes Sampson was a respected midwife and healer in Scotland. She cured illness, delivered children, knew remedies passed down for generations. She was accused after King James VI blamed witches for a storm that nearly killed him. Agnes was tortured for days. Her head shaved, her body searched, her limbs crushed. Eventually she confessed, not because it was true, but because pain demands obedience. She was strangled and burned in 1591. Isabel Gowdy, the most haunting voice. Isabel Gowdy confessed to witchcraft in 1662, but her confession was different. She was not tortured, she spoke freely, and what she described still chills historians. She spoke of night flights, shape-shifting, fairy realms, coven rituals. Her account was vivid, poetic, consistent. Too consistent. Some believe she was mentally ill, others believe she entered trance states. That Isabel accessed altered states of consciousness so real they became indistinguishable from experience. Whether hallucination or vision, she believed it, and belief in a system like this was enough. Many accused witches were elderly, widows that were poor and alone. If they asked for food and were refused, and misfortune followed, suspicion bloomed. Old age itself became evidence. They looked like the devil's caricature, and caricatures are easier to kill than people. While women were the primary targets, men were not spared, especially healers, hermits, and social outsiders. Accused by association men were often framed as collaborators. Women were framed as origins. Most witches died without names recorded. They appear only as entries: executed, burned, confessed. No last words, no memorials, no graves, just absence. This is the true scale of loss. Even after death, the accused were denied dignity. Their property was seized, their families shamed, their names erased. The fire did not just kill bodies, it rewrote memory. Part 7. Did any of it work? Here's a question that makes historians uncomfortable. So uncomfortable that it is often avoided entirely, not because it justifies the witch hunts, but because it threatens a simpler story. The question is this: was absolutely everything dismissed as witchcraft meaningless? For centuries, the witch hunts were explained as ignorance colliding with fear, and that explanation is comforting. Because if nothing real existed beneath the accusations, then we can safely place the past behind glass. But what if beneath the superstition, the hysteria, the cruelty, there were genuine altered states of consciousness that modern culture barely understands? To ask whether witchcraft worked is not to ask whether people cast spells that violated physics. It is to ask whether belief can alter perception, if ritual can change behavior, or trance can access buried cognitive abilities. Modern psychology answers yes. Hypnosis exists, placebo effects exist, psychosomatic illness exists. The mind is not passive. It shapes reality at the level of experience, and experience drives behavior. Fasting, isolation, rhythm, repetition, these techniques reliably induce altered states. Neuroscience now confirms this. The brain changes under ritual, boundaries dissolve. Time distorts, identity loosens. These are not signs of evil, they are human capabilities. Expectation shapes outcomes. A curse does not need magic to work, it only needs belief. This requires no permission. Authorities always found this autonomy intolerable. Were there people who used fear deliberately? Probably, since there are humans. In every society there are those who manipulate belief. But the witch hunts erased nuance. Everything was flattened into guilt. The church feared that witches distorted reality. Instead, it created a reality so distorted that tens of thousands died. The devil did not need to act. Humans did the work themselves. So did witchcraft work, not as fantasy, not as fireballs and curses, but as human potential, misunderstood and weaponized. The tragedy is not that people believed in magic. The tragedy is that belief was punished instead of understood. Every society eventually encounters phenomena it cannot explain, and every society chooses one of two paths: curiosity or persecution. History shows which one is easier. Part 8. The Modern Shadow. Witch hunts did not end, they changed vocabulary. We like to believe that modernity cured us, that science replaced superstition, that reason defeated fear, that education made persecution impossible. History disagrees. The state no longer needed demons to govern. Today they use psychological propaganda tricks such as projection, falsifying evidence, and fostering enemy images. Different labels, same mechanics, and life's destroyed again. The psychology never changed. What changed was the language. The accusation always targets the same fear, that someone is challenging the power structure by telling a different narrative. Today, we don't burn people. We isolate them, deplatform them, debank them, ruin reputations. Every generation invents its witches, the wrong ideas, the wrong opinions. When fear needs an outlet, evidence becomes optional. In a world that feels increasingly abstract, the return to earth-centered belief feels grounding. That alone makes it suspicious to centralize systems. We are not more rational than our ancestors. We are simply more confident, and confidence without humility is dangerous. Part 9. The Lie of the Ending. Witch hunts did not conclude with apologies. They ended quietly. No reckoning, no accountability, no restoration of raised knowledge. The fires simply stopped being useful. And when something stops being useful to power, it is not destroyed, it is archived. Throughout history, knowledge without permission has always been punished, not because it is false, but because it is uncontrollable. We count bodies, we rarely count what vanished with them. Remedies never recorded, rituals never written. Ways of understanding the body and mind that died in silence. We do not know what was lost, and that ignorance feels safe. Ask yourself this, honestly. If you lived then, if everyone around you believed, if authority sanctioned it, if dissent meant suspicion, would you have spoken? Or would you have stayed quiet, like most people did? The fire was not just punishment. It was theater. A warning. A demonstration. A lesson taught publicly. This is what happens to those who step outside the story we allow. The old religion did not disappear. It dissolved. Into folklore, into fairy tales, into intuition, into dreams, into places where authority has difficulty reaching. And perhaps that is where it always belonged. This is it.
Thank you for now.